In the shadow of America's storied past lies a dark and often unspoken chapter, one that haunts the nation's conscience to this day. This is the story of slavery, a brutal system that reduced millions of human beings to mere property, stripping them of their dignity, freedom, and humanity. The institution of slavery in the United States was not just a historical anomaly. It was a foundational element of the Southern economy and society, a system that thrived on the exploitation and dehumanization of an entire race. Imagine a world where your life was not your own, where every moment, every breath was controlled by someone else, where your family could be torn apart at a moment's notice, sold like livestock to the highest bidder. This was the reality for millions of enslaved African Americans in the United States. They were born into a life of servitude, with no hope of ever being free. They were not considered human beings but rather property, commodities to be bought, sold, and used at the whim of their white owners. The roots of this system trace back to the early days of American colonization. As the demand for labor in the burgeoning agricultural economy grew, so did the need for a workforce that could be readily controlled and exploited. Enslaved Africans brought to the Americas in chains provided the solution. They were forced to work in the fields, plantations, and homes of their owners, enduring unimaginable hardships and cruelties. The South, with its vast plantations and rich soil, became the heart of the slave system. The cultivation of cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar cane required massive amounts of labor, and enslaved people were the backbone of this system. The wealth of the Southern elite was built on the backs of these enslaved individuals, who labored from dawn till dusk, under the watchful eyes of overseers who wielded whips and chains to ensure compliance. But the cruelty of slavery extended far beyond physical labor. Enslaved people were denied the most basic human rights. They could not marry without permission, and even then their marriages held no legal standing. Families were frequently torn apart, as children were separated from their parents and sold to different owners. The bonds of kinship, so fundamental to human experience, were systematically destroyed. The legal system of the South was designed to uphold and enforce this brutal regime. Slaves had no rights. They could not own property, make contracts, or testify in court. They were not allowed to learn to read or write, for fear that education might lead to rebellion. Any act of defiance, no matter how small, could result in severe punishment, including whippings, beatings, and even death. The economic underpinnings of slavery were complex and deeply intertwined with the broader American economy. The cotton produced by enslaved labor in the South was the lifeblood of the textile industry in the North and in Europe. It fueled industrial growth and generated vast wealth, not just for the Southern plantation owners, but for merchants, traders, and manufacturers across the nation and around the world. This economic interdependence made it difficult for many to envision a world without slavery, even as the moral arguments against it grew stronger. In the North, the abolitionist movement gained momentum, with activists and reformers speaking out against the injustices of slavery. They argued that the institution was not only morally reprehensible, but also a threat to the principles of liberty and democracy upon which the nation was founded. The divide between the North and the South grew wider, leading to political tensions and ultimately to the Civil War. The war, which began in 1861 and lasted until 1865, brought an end to the legal institution of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were free. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. However, the end of legal slavery did not mean the end of racial oppression. The Reconstruction era saw efforts to rebuild the South and grant rights to newly freed African Americans, but these efforts were met with violent resistance. The rise of Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and disenfranchisement, meant that the legacy of slavery continued to shape American society for generations. Today, the scars of slavery remain. The systemic racism and inequality that persist in the United States are rooted in the long history of enslavement and the subsequent efforts to maintain white supremacy. The struggle for true equality and justice continues, as communities grapple with the lasting impacts of this dark chapter in American history. In the end, The story of slavery is a stark reminder of the depths to which human beings can sink, when greed and power are allowed to override compassion and justice. It is a story that must be remembered not to dwell on the past, but to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The journey toward a just and equitable society is ongoing, and it begins with acknowledging the full weight of our history.